The air in the listening station had a specific weight to it, a thickness born of endless coffee, stale cigarette smoke, and the low, insistent hum of vacuum tubes and reel-to-reel tape recorders. Nestled in a patch of West German woodland that appeared on no public maps, Facility D4 was one of the National Security Agency's most sensitive European ears. A concrete abscess in the earth pointed directly at the Iron Curtain, 200 miles to the east. Its mission was simple: listen. Listen to everything. The chattering typewriters of East German border guards, the encrypted squawks of Soviet air defense radar, the microwave links between Warsaw Pact headquarters. It was a cathedral of noise, and its priests were men like Staff Sergeant Eli Voss. Voss was not a typical soldier. He had been a doctoral candidate in mathematics at Princeton before the draft notice came. A young man more comfortable with the elegant abstractions of number theory than the brutish realities of basic training. The Army, in a rare moment of perceptive bureaucracy, had recognized his peculiar genius and dropped him not into a muddy trench, but into the subterranean, climate-controlled chaos of signals intelligence. He was a cryptologic linguist, a title that meant he didn't just speak languages, he spoke the language of patterns, of randomness, of the hidden order in chaos. The night it began was unremarkable. October 14, 1961. The Berlin Wall was a month old, and the world seemed to be holding its breath. Voss was on the deep sweep, a monotonous but critical task of listening to frequencies considered empty or used only for low-priority civilian traffic. The theory was that the Soviets, in a moment of supreme cleverness, might hide their most sensitive communications in plain sight, on a frequency everyone else ignored. It was needle in a haystack work, and the haystack was the entire electromagnetic spectrum. His headphones were a universe of hiss and pop, cosmic background radiation, atmospheric disturbances, the ghostly echoes of lightning storms over the Urals. Then at 03:17 GMT, he heard it, a whisper. It was not a voice. It was a sequence of 7 tones, perfectly pure, each lasting exactly 1 second. A pause of 7 seconds. Then the sequence repeated. It was mind-numbingly simple, childishly so, unlike the complex machine gun rattle of normal Soviet military encryption. He sat up, his back straightening from its habitual slouch. He checked the frequency, 4628 kilohertz. A quiet backwater, officially allocated to East German river navigation on the Elbe. But no river pilot used tones like this. They were too clean, too precise, generated by a crystal-controlled oscillator, not a human voice. He logged it. Anomalous tonal sequence, 4628 kilohertz, repeating, possibly a beacon. He ran a standard analysis. The tones were not a simple musical scale. Their frequencies were prime numbers, converted to hertz: 139, 159, 157, 173, 179, 193, 199. A sequence of primes. This was not an accident. This was a signature. For 3 nights the sequence repeated, always starting at 03:17 GMT, always lasting exactly 1 hour. On the 4th night, it changed. After the 7th tone, there was a new sound, a burst of data. Less than 2 seconds of raw, screeching digital noise, a packet of information compressed into a sonic bullet, then silence for the rest of the hour. This was the pattern, a prime-numbered handshake followed by a data burst. A transmission protocol of eerily mathematical beauty. He filed his reports. They went up the chain. The initial assessment from NSA headquarters at Fort Meade was dismissive. Probable telemetry for an obscure scientific or industrial project. Monitor and log, priority low. But Voss couldn't let it go. The primes haunted him. They were a calling card, a sign that someone, somewhere, was thinking like he did. In the dead hours of his shift, he began a private project. He started recording the data bursts and, using Facility D4's limited computational power, a room-sized IBM 7090 that required punch cards, he tried to unpack them. The encryption was formidable, a layered beast that defied their standard brute force attacks. But Voss wasn't trying to break it. He was trying to understand its grammar. He noticed something strange. The length of the data bursts varied, but they always contained a number of digital bits that was itself a prime number. And the intervals between bursts, when measured in milliseconds, were also prime. It was a system utterly obsessed with the most fundamental, indivisible numbers in mathematics. This wasn't just secure communication, it was a numerological ritual. His obsession grew. He requested and was denied more dedicated computer time. He began staying after his shift, sketching prime number sequences on graph paper, mapping the transmission times onto maps of Eastern Europe. He saw no pattern, no clear point of origin. The signal strength was curiously uniform, as if it was being broadcast from everywhere and nowhere. His colleagues started calling him the Prime Minister. His superiors grew uneasy. He was a brilliant asset, but brilliance edged toward instability. He was chasing a ghost. Then, in February 1962, he found the key. Or rather, the key found him. Exhausted, he'd been playing with the tonal sequence, transposing the prime frequencies into musical notes. He had a small, cheap harmonica on his desk, a relic from a failed attempt at a hobby. Absent-mindedly, he tried to match the first tone, 139 hertz. It was close to a D sharp. He played the sequence: D sharp, F, F sharp, A sharp, C, D. It was dissonant, jarring. He played it again, slower, and then from some deep recess of memory, a fragment of his childhood in a Leipzig church before his family fled in '53, surfaced. A hymn, a particular somber Lutheran chorale. With trembling hands, he found the sheet music for "When We Are in Deepest Need." The melody line for the first phrase matched his prime sequence, note for note, if you transposed it to a different key. The 7 primes were the first 7 notes of the chorale. It wasn't just a random sequence. It was a quote. A hymn of desperation broadcast into the night. The realization was a physical shock. This was not a machine talking to a machine. This was a person with a deep, nostalgic knowledge of German Protestant hymns, using the most secure, mathematical framework imaginable to send a message of existential distress. The data bursts weren't just reports. They were a cry for help, wrapped in an unbreakable code. Voss went to his commanding officer, Major Briggs, a career intelligence man with a face like weathered saddle leather. He laid out his evidence, the primes, the hymn, the impossible signal propagation. "Sir, this isn't telemetry. This is a person, an asset or a prisoner, someone with immense cryptographic knowledge signaling us. They're in the deepest need. We have to find them." Briggs lit a cigarette, his eyes cold. "Sergeant Voss, you're seeing patterns in the clouds. This is a numbers game, and the other side is good at it. It's a trick, a Soviet provocation to make us waste resources chasing phantoms. You are to stand down. That's a direct order. Your clearance for the deep sweep is revoked. You're reassigned to traffic analysis, effective immediately." Reassignment to traffic analysis was a form of bureaucratic exile. Instead of hunting for ghosts in the empty spectrum, Voss now spent his days categorizing the known, logging the call signs of Soviet transport planes, counting the transmissions of East German police units, building a picture of ordinary military busywork. It was suffocating. The prime-numbered hymn played in his head, a constant, taunting refrain. He began his rebellion with a notebook, a simple, black-covered ledger he could hide in his locker.
Using his still valid access to the facility's library of signal logs and oversight in his downgraded clearance, he began to retrospectively trace the 0317 broadcasts. He went back months, painstakingly copying the logs of the few other operators who had noted the anomaly and dismissed it. He built a timeline. The signal had begun, he discovered, not in 1961, but in April of 1959. Over 2.5 years of nightly whispers into the void. He plotted the dates. No pattern. He plotted the signal strength variations from different listening posts. They showed a bizarre consistency. The signal never peaked or faded from a specific direction like a normal transmitter. It was as if the source was moving, or the signal was being rebroadcast by a network of relays. Then, one sleepless night in his barracks, he had a second revelation. He wasn't looking at a location. He was looking at a schedule. The primes weren't just the content, they were the coordinates. He returned to his notebook. The first prime in the sequence was 139. The transmission started at 0317. 3 and 17 were also primes. What if the numbers were a map, not of space, but of time and meaning? He began treating each broadcast as a data point in a multidimensional grid. The date, a set of numbers, the time, the prime sequence, the length of the subsequent data burst. He needed a key, a Rosetta Stone to translate this numerical landscape. He found it in the most obvious place he had overlooked, the hymn itself. Wenn wir in höchsten Nöten sein. He researched it. It was written in 1524, during the Peasants' War, a time of apocalyptic fear and upheaval. The hymn's text spoke of being surrounded by death, with no helper or advisor in sight. It was a hymn for the utterly forsaken. The data bursts. They were the cry. What if they weren't just encrypted messages, but encrypted sensor data? What if the person broadcasting wasn't just sending a plea, but was reporting on their environment? He remembered a briefing on Soviet deep underground command bunkers, how they monitored air pressure, radiation levels, geostatic stress. Working now with a frantic, clandestine energy, Voss devised a test. He couldn't decrypt the burst, but he could measure its length, which was always a prime number of bits. He plotted the sequence of these primes over several weeks. They formed no obvious progression. Then he had another idea. He subtracted the date's Julian day number from the prime length of the burst. The results were a jumble. He tried dividing, multiplying, nothing. Despair was setting in when he simply lined up the burst length primes in the order they were received and looked at the differences between them. There it was, a pattern of increments. +4, +6, +10, +12, +16. He recognized it instantly. It was the sequence of prime gaps, the differences between consecutive prime numbers. Between 7 and 11 is 4, between 11 and 13 is 2, but the sequence of gaps itself has a rough, increasing trend. The sender was encoding the burst based on an internal counter of prime gaps. This was a mind that not only thought in primes, but thought in the architecture of primes. This internal counter, Voss realized, could be a clock, a count of days, or significant events. He assumed it started when the broadcasts began in April of 1959. He aligned it. Suddenly, the variations in burst length made a terrible sense. The longer bursts correlated precisely with periods of known international crisis. The U-2 shootdown in May 1960, the Paris summit collapse, the Bay of Pigs, the raising of the Berlin Wall. During these times of heightened tension, the data bursts grew longer, as if the sender was working feverishly, reporting more, sensing the world above trembling on the brink. The map was now clear. He wasn't pinpointing a city on a map. He was pinpointing a consciousness in a prison of time. The sender was in a static location, a deep, fixed bunker, but their output was a precise reflection of global geopolitical stress. They were a human seismograph for the Cold War, and their own distress, encoded in the hymn, was constant. Voss had pieced together the where and the what. The sender was in an ultra-secure, deep underground facility, likely designed to survive a nuclear war. They had access to sophisticated cryptographic equipment and global intelligence feeds. How else would their sensor data so accurately mirror world events? They were a mathematician or scientist of the highest order, imprisoned in a gilded, subterranean cage, forced to work using the very system they were enslaved by to send a hopeless, poetic signal of rebellion. He had to get this to someone who would listen. He compiled his findings, the HIM correlation, the prime gap clock, the crisis correlation, into a concise, devastating 4-page report. He bypassed Major Briggs entirely. He used a covert personal contact from his Princeton days, now a junior analyst at the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology. He mailed the report in a plain envelope via an APO address he hoped wasn't monitored. A week later, he was summoned not to Briggs's office, but to the facility's secure conference room. Waiting for him were 2 men he didn't know. One was tall, with a groomed calm that screamed Langley. The other was smaller, older, with eyes that missed nothing. This was Dr. Alan Falk, a legendary cryptologist from NSA, a man who had helped break Japanese codes in the war. "Sergeant Voss," Falk began, his voice soft but filling the room. "Your report is the most extraordinary piece of signals analysis I have seen in 20 years. You have found a ghost, and you have given it a name, an address, and a heartbeat." He paused. "What you have also done, son, is kick over a hornet's nest we've been carefully watching for 2 years. The CIA man leaned forward. "The facility you've described, we believe it exists. We call it Weisberg, White Castle, a myth, a folktale in East German intelligence circles. A place where the best scientific minds of the Warsaw Pact are taken to work on problems of existential defense. They enter, they don't leave. We thought it was just a story to frighten dissidents. You've just provided the first proof it's real, and you've made contact with one of its prisoners." Falk steepled his fingers. "The individual you've identified, based on the mathematical sophistication and the cultural reference, we believe is Dr. Felix Kohler, a German quantum cryptographer, disappeared from the University of Leipzig in 1958, the foremost mind in theoretical encryption of his generation. The Soviets didn't just want him, they wanted his mind to build them a code even God couldn't break. It seems he's been building something else, a back door, a HIM." Voss's head swam. It was real, all of it. "Here is the situation, Sergeant," the CIA man said, his tone turning grave. "You have identified a high-value asset in the most secure location imaginable. You have also alerted us to a transmission protocol that, if the wrong people in Moscow realize what it is, will get Dr. Kohler shot in the head. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is over. We take it from here." "But I can help," Voss started. "You're a liability," the CIA man stated flatly. "You acted against orders. You communicated classified findings through an unauthorized channel. By all rights, your career is over. However, Dr. Falk has insisted your unique empathy with the subject may still be of use. You are to return to your duties. You will cease all investigation. You will be watched. The White Castle file is now above your clearance. Is that understood?" Voss was dismissed. He had been validated and neutered in the same breath. He had proven the voice was real, only to have it taken from him. That night at 0317, he sat alone in the barracks common room with a shortwave receiver he'd built from spare parts, hidden under a blanket. He tuned it to 4628 kilohertz. The 7 pure tones sang out into the dark room, the hymn of deepest need. Then the data burst, a screech of encrypted despair. For the first time, Voss understood its content perfectly. It was a scream into a void that had just briefly blinked back, and now the void was telling him to look away. He couldn't. The obsession had become a covenant. He had heard the cry, he had answered, and he would not abandon the voice now. The map was drawn. He just had to find a way to follow it.
The hangar at Area 51 was a cathedral of tension, its vaulted space echoing with the low whine of power units and the hushed, profane whispers of men staring at what they'd built. The aircraft, designated YF-104, looked less like a machine meant to fly and more like a dart thrown by a god. Its wings were stubs, a mere 7 feet from root to tip, razor thin as butcher knives. Its fuselage with a needle, piercing the air even at rest. It was all engine, a monstrous General Electric J79 afterburning turbojet, with a cockpit slapped on top as an afterthought. It was the embodiment of Kelly Johnson's hot rod philosophy at Lockheed Skunk Works. Brute force and brutal simplicity, pushed to the bleeding edge of the possible. On paper, its performance was theoretical, a cluster of equations that promised Mach 2 speed and climb rates that would leave every other aircraft on the planet looking stationary. In metal, it looked like a death trap. The first pilot assigned to fly it was a legendary test pilot, a man who had tamed every beast the Air Force had thrown at him. He walked the length of the YF-104 in the hangar's sterile light, his eyes tracing the non-existent wing, the massive intake, the T-tail perched precariously on the rear. He spent an hour in the cockpit, a cramped tube where his knees brushed the instrument panel. He emerged pale, his usual swagger absent. "I won't fly it," he told Johnson and the Air Force colonels, his voice flat. "That thing isn't an airplane. It's a rocket with a seat. The moment you get slow on approach, it'll drop like a spear. And those wings? You can't call those wings. They're fins. It's not a question of if it spins in, it's when." He was reassigned. The second pilot was younger, hungrier, a captain with a reputation for cold, analytical courage. He accepted the assignment, but the night before the scheduled flight, he typed a formal letter to his wife and placed it in his footlocker. It wasn't sentimentality. It was the mathematical certainty of a man who understood aerodynamics. The wing loading, the weight supported by each square foot of wing, was astronomical. At low speeds, it would be like trying to balance a grand piano on a postage stamp. The landing speed estimate was a conjecture that bordered on fiction. He wrote his will because the numbers told him to. But he never strapped in. A last-minute review of wind tunnel data that had been rushed, extrapolated from smaller models, showed a vicious, unpredictable pitch-up tendency at high angles of attack. The computer predicted a stall that would be unrecoverable. The flight was scrubbed. The captain stood down, a complex mix of relief and professional disappointment clouding his face. The third man was Tony Zipper McCready. He wasn't the most senior, nor the most technically gifted pilot on the roster, but he possessed two qualities essential for this moment: an almost supernatural feel for an aircraft's instincts, and a fatalistic disregard for his own mortality forged over 75 missions in Korea. He looked at the YF-104 and saw not just the danger, but the intent. "Kelly didn't build a plane to land," McCready said, chewing an unlit cigar. "He built a plane to go. My job is to point it at the sky and light the damn candle. We'll figure out the rest later." On the morning of the flight, the air over the Nevada desert was still and cold. The YF-104 was towed to the runway, a silver sliver against the vast baked earth. The ground crew moved around it with funereal solemnity. McCready, encased in his pressure suit, gave a thumbs up that was more challenge than reassurance. He lit the J79. The sound was not a roar. It was a sustained, tearing shriek that vibrated in the chests of everyone on the flight line. The aircraft trembled, a racehorse at the gate. Release. The afterburner ignited with a visible punch of heat haze. The aircraft didn't accelerate down the runway, it evaporated down it, becoming a blur, then a dot, then leaping into the air after an impossibly short roll. It seemed to hang for a heart-stopping second on its jet efflux, then the nose tilted upward, and kept tilting. It wasn't climbing, it was ascending, drilling a hole straight up into the blue. The chase plane, a sleek F-100 Super Sabre already straining, was left behind as if it had thrown an anchor. In the control room, the radar operator called out numbers in a voice rising with disbelief. "Passing 20,000, 30,000, 40, rate of climb exceeding 15,000 feet per minute. The predicted maximum was 12,000. For 45 minutes, McCready put the aircraft through its paces. The predicted violent stall? It was there. But he found that with the revolutionary new boundary layer control system, bleeding engine air over the stub wings, the machine retained shocking control even when the rulebook said it should fall. The landing was the stuff of instant legend. He came in not like an airplane, but like a missile with a problem, the needle-slim fuselage parallel to the concrete, and settled onto the runway with a shriek of tires, the minuscule wings generating just enough lift in that final second to prevent a crater.
When he climbed out, he was grinning. "Boys," he shouted over the dying whine of the engine, "you've built a goddamn starship." Back in the data shack, a Quonset hut smelling of hot electronics and burnt coffee, the engineers huddled over the telemetry readouts. Paper scrolls unfurled across tables, scribbled with inked lines from the oscillographs. The numbers weren't just good, they were impossible. The chief aerodynamicist, a man named Wallace who hadn't slept in 48 hours, pointed a trembling finger at a velocity trace. "Look at this acceleration curve from Mach 0.9 to Mach 1.2. It's vertical. The drag rise is practically non-existent." The area rule theory, he referenced the revolutionary Coke bottle fuselage shaping, "it's working better than we modeled. Far better." But it was the maneuverability data that caused real panic. A junior engineer named Chen had been tasked with analyzing the control inputs during a series of high G turns. He ran the calculations 3 times, each time getting the same absurd result. He finally called Wallace over. "Sir, the roll rate, at altitude, with the new hydraulic boost system, I'm calculating an initial roll rate of over 720 degrees per second." Wallace stared. A conventional fighter of the era, the F-100, the F-86, might manage 180 degrees per second. The best anyone had theorized for a supersonic design was maybe 300. 720 was a number from science fiction. It meant the aircraft could complete 2 full rotations along its longitudinal axis in a single second. "You've made a unit error," Wallace snapped. "I haven't, sir. Look at the aileron deflection trace and the corresponding gyro feedback. The airframe is responding instantly. There's no lag, no flex. The wings are so short and stiff, they're acting like control surfaces directly welded to the fuselage. It's not flying. It's pointing." They pored over the structural telemetry. The airframe that they had feared would flex and flutter like a tuning fork under stress was reporting loads within tolerance. The frightening pitch-up tendency was real, but the data showed the aircraft, instead of stalling into a spin, would simply weather vane through it with a sudden breathtaking snap if the pilot was aggressive enough. It didn't defy physics, it operated in a razor-thin slice of physics no other aircraft could access. Kelly Johnson arrived, summoned from Burbank. He reviewed the data in silence, his famous hawk-like face impassive. He took a slide rule from his pocket. He distrusted the new room-sized computers and ran his own set of checks. After 10 minutes, he put the slide rule down. The room held its breath.
The briefing in the Pentagon's secure tank, the soundproofed, electronically swept room deep within the building, had a different atmosphere than the Skunk Works debrief. Here, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of cold power. The men around the table were not engineers. They were generals, admirals, and civilian strategists with maps of Europe and Asia etched into their minds. For months, the YF-104 had been a curiosity, a technology demonstrator. A slideshow of its insane performance was presented alongside grainy, smuggled photographs of a new Soviet aircraft taken at a Moscow airshow. The Soviet plane was a monster in its own right, the MiG-21. It was fast, agile, and crucially, it was rolling off production lines in the thousands. Intelligence suggested it could outrun and outclimb every frontline fighter NATO possessed. The slide clicked to a side-by-side comparison, the sleek, delta-winged MiG-21 and the needle-like YF-104. The presenter, a young major from Air Force Intelligence, gave the sober assessment. The MiG-21 has a better sustained turn rate, better low-speed handling, and superior range. It is a more versatile, more pilot-friendly aircraft. It will win a dogfight against any F-100 or F-8 we have. A 4-star general from Tactical Air Command leaned forward, his medals clicking against the table. "So where's the good news, Major?" The Major clicked to the next slide. It showed a single metric, rate of climb. The YF-104's bar dwarfed the MiG-21's. The next slide, acceleration, the same. The next, maximum speed at altitude. The YF-104's bar went off the chart. The good news, General, is that the YF-104 doesn't dogfight. It doesn't turn with the enemy. It points at a point in the sky ahead of the enemy, goes straight to that point faster than they can react, fires, and then uses its climb rate to reset the engagement on its own terms. It is an interceptor in its purest, most ruthless form. The MiG-21 is a scalpel. The YF-104 is a bullet. There was a long silence. The strategists saw it now. NATO doctrine was being outflanked. The Soviets were building a vast fleet of fast, high-flying bombers, like the Tu-22 Blinder, and equally fast fighters to protect them. The existing NATO interceptors would be too slow to catch them, too sluggish to engage their escorts. The battle for air superiority, the essential prerequisite for any European war, was about to be lost before the first shot was fired. The Deputy Secretary of Defense, a politically astute man who understood the language of both budgets and body bags, spoke last. "We don't need a better airplane, gentlemen. We need an airplane that changes the calculus. This," he said, tapping the projected image of the YF-104, "changes the calculus. The Soviets build for the war they want to fight. We must build for the war we cannot afford to lose. The MiG-21 is a better fighter. The YF-104 is a deterrent." The decision was made without a vote. The order was transmitted to the Air Force and Lockheed that night. Accelerate the program. Move from YF to F. Begin production planning immediately. Operational deployment is the sole priority. Deploy it immediately. The F-104 Starfighter was born not from a desire for a balanced aircraft, but from a moment of strategic terror. It was an emergency stopgap. A silver bullet rushed into production to plug a hole in the sky through which Soviet bombers were expected to pour. Its flaws, the treacherous landing characteristics, the high-speed stall, the minimal range were noted and then deliberately, officially ignored. The monster had a mission. The location was over the Taiwan Strait, 1958. The crisis was Quemoy and Matsu, two tiny islands becoming flashpoints for World War III. The People's Liberation Army Air Force, flying Soviet-supplied MiG-17s, was testing the perimeter, probing nationalist Chinese and American resolve. A flight of F-104As, fresh off the boat and assigned to the Republic of China Air Force with American advisors in the controls, was on alert. The call came at dawn. Multiple bandits, high, approaching the patrol line. The two starfighters, call signs Duke 01 and 02, scrambled. Their climb was a violation of nature. By the time the slower prop-driven radar planes had painted the contacts, the F-104s were already at 40,000 feet, their engines shrieking in the thin air. The GCI controller's voice was tense in their helmets. Duke flight. Bandits at your 12, 30 miles, same altitude. Assess as MiG-17 Frescos. You are weapons free. In the cockpit of Duke 01, Major Sam Shark Finley saw the blips on his primitive radar scope. The MiG-17 was a nimble, deadly opponent at lower altitudes. But up here, at the edge of the stratosphere, it was in his world. He didn't turn. He didn't maneuver. He pushed the throttle into afterburner, feeling the kick in the back, and pointed the needle nose of his starfighter directly at the center of the enemy formation. In the radar rooms below, operators watched the blips converge at a combined closing speed approaching Mach 2.5. Then, the MiG blips scattered, breaking formation. The F-104 blips didn't waver. The legend was born in that moment of pure, predatory geometry. The starfighter didn't dogfight. It conducted aerial assassination. "Tone," Finley said calmly as his radar-seeking Sidewinder missile growled in his ear. He fired. A streak of smoke and flame lanced ahead. One MiG-17 blip vanished from the screen. No explosion was seen. At that speed and altitude, the engagement was silent, abstract. Finley didn't follow the kill. He pulled back on the stick with gentle, immense pressure. The G-suit squeezed his legs and abdomen as the starfighter executed a zoom climb that made the world outside the canopy turn dark blue, then black. He was rocketing towards space, trading speed for altitude in a maneuver no MiG could dream of matching. Duke 02, his wingman, had latched on to another MiG. The Soviet-built fighter tried to turn to bring its cannons to bear. The F-104 pilot simply rolled. The world outside his canopy became a gray blur. In less than a second, he had inverted his aircraft, pulled back on the stick, and was now cutting across the MiG's turn circle. Inside it, a short, snapping burst from the 20mm Vulcan, a Gatling gun mounted in the fuselage, and the MiG came apart. The third MiG pilot, seeing his two comrades disintegrate in seconds, dove for the deck, hoping the thick, low-altitude air would negate the American speed advantage. The F-104 pilot followed, but not in a dive. He performed a negative G pushover, his body lifting against the straps, and then lit the afterburner again. He fell out of the sky like a thunderbolt. accelerating past the sound barrier in the descent. He overtook the fleeing MiG as if it were parked, rolled upright, and gave a single, long burst. The results were final. The entire engagement lasted less than 90 seconds. 3 kills. No damage to the F-104s. When they returned to base, the ground crews found the aircraft's skin still frosty from the upper atmosphere, the metal cold to the touch. The pilots emerged, not with the wild exhilaration of a dogfight won, but with the eerie calm of men who had performed a clinical procedure. The after-action reports were sanitized for classification, but the pilot chatter couldn't be contained. "It's not a fair fight," one of the advisors was overheard saying in the officers' club. "You see him, you point, you go. He can't run, he can't hide. Turning feels like you're going to tear the wings off, but the damn things don't tear. It's like cheating physics." The legend of the missile with a man in it was born. It was flawed, it was dangerous, it was unforgiving, but in that narrow, terrifying envelope of high-altitude, high-speed interception for which it was born, it was peerless. It faced the best that the Eastern Bloc had to offer and made them look obsolete. The monster, for all its flaws, had found its purpose, and in doing so, had rewritten the rules of the sky.
The wreckage was a treasure trove. In the spring of 1959, a Taiwanese-piloted F-104A, suffering an engine flameout over the strait, had ditched in shallow water. Soviet fishing trawlers, floating intelligence platforms bristling with antennas, were on scene within hours. And while the pilot was recovered by the Americans, the carcass of the aircraft was not. In the dark of night, it was hauled onto the deck of a disguised salvage vessel and whisked away to a secured dock in Vladivostok. From there, it traveled in a sealed train car to a nameless facility outside Moscow, a place known only as OKB-124, the Soviet Union's premier center for foreign technology exploitation. For the engineers and pilots of OKB-124, this was the Rosetta Stone. The MiG-21 had been a response to rumors of the starfighter's performance. Now they had the real thing, battered, salt-corroded, but largely intact. They measured every rivet, analyzed the aluminum alloy, and marveled at the simplicity of the hydraulic system. They fired up the captured J-79 engine on a test stand, and the shriek it produced was both terrifying and humbling. They confirmed the numbers. The thrust-to-weight ratio was superior to anything in their inventory. But it was the radar tapes from the engagement over the strait that truly baffled them. The tapes, retrieved from ground stations and painstakingly analyzed, didn't show an aircraft performing maneuvers. They showed a blip that seemed to violate the laws of kinematics. One tape in particular became the subject of a secret all-night symposium. Senior engineer Petrov, a man who had helped design the MiG-21's flight control system, played the tape for a room of stony-faced officers and scientists. The screen showed a radarscope's green sweep, 2 blips, a slower, weaving MiG-17 and the F-104. "Observe," Petrov said, his voice tense. "The MiG is executing a maximum performance turn, approximately 4 Gs. A standard pursuit curve would have the American here." He pointed to a spot behind the MiG. "But watch. The F-104 blip didn't curve. It seemed to jump. It vanished from one edge of the MiG's turn circle and reappeared almost instantly on the opposite side, its velocity vector changing with a discontinuity that made no physical sense. The radar tracking computer, programmed with standard aerodynamic models, had briefly rejected the data as an error." Petrov froze the image. "This is not a roll rate we understand. Our best estimate," he paused, checking his notes, "exceeds 600 degrees per second. Instantaneous. There is no transition. It is as if the aircraft has no inertia." A test pilot in the room, a hero of the Soviet Union named Alexander Sasha Kirov, shook his head. "That is non-human. No pilot can process a horizon moving that fast. No vestibular system can cope. He would be disoriented, unconscious." "He wasn't," Petrov replied flatly, "because he did it again and again. Look at this thermosignature data from the infrared tracker." He switched to another readout. The MiG's engine showed as a steady, hot bloom. The F-104's signature was a strobe light, flaring violently in afterburner, then almost vanishing as the pilot chopped throttle and used kinetic energy to maneuver, then flaring again. It was an energy management technique so aggressive, it seems suicidal. He is treating his engine like a light switch. He is not flying a sustained curve, he is executing a series of connected, instantaneous vector changes. It is not aerodynamics, it is geometry. The room descended into a frustrated silence. They had the plane. They could measure its wings, its weight,
its engine power, but they could not replicate the philosophy. Their design ethos was one of balance: lift, thrust, drag, control, all in harmonious compromise. The Starfighter was a rejection of harmony. It was a weapon of extremes, where one extreme, brutal thrust, compensated for another, minimal lift, and the pilot was not a flyer, but a system operator directing a kinetic projectile. The most telling moment came in a private briefing for the Deputy Minister of Defense. After showing the data, the head of OKB-124 concluded, "We can build an aircraft as fast. Perhaps we can build one that climbs as well. But to build one that does what this does would require us to abandon everything we know about stable pilot-friendly design. We would have to build a machine that is, by our standards, unflyable." The Deputy Minister, a veteran of Stalingrad, stared at the frozen radar image of the impossible maneuver. He asked the question that would echo through Soviet design bureaus for a decade. How do you fight something that shouldn't exist? They never found a satisfactory answer. Their response was the MiG-25 Foxbot, a monstrous interceptor built of steel to withstand the heat of Mach 3 flight. It was fast in a straight line, a terrified reaction to the Starfighter's performance envelope, but it was a blunt instrument, heavy, unmaneuverable, a product of the same old philosophy scaled up. It was an admission that they could not replicate the American monster, so they would build a different, bigger monster to run it down. They never truly understood that the Starfighter's secret wasn't in its metal, but in its merciless, one-dimensional intent. The F-104's service life was brutal. It earned grim nicknames: the Lawn Dart for its perilous landing profile, the Widowmaker for its staggering accident rates, especially in the hands of Allied air forces less rigorously trained than the USAF. Investigators pored over crash wreckage, looking for a fundamental flaw. They found many: the T-tail that could blank out in certain stalls, the downward ejecting seat that was useless at low altitude, and the razor-thin wings that shed ice with catastrophic results. But through the 1960s, a strange pattern emerged. The aircraft that killed so many pilots in training and in routine flight was proving almost invincible in its intended role: high-altitude intercept. Its kill ratio in potential engagements, from Taiwan to the Berlin Corridor, was absurdly lopsided. It was as if the plane had a split personality: a demon during takeoff and landing, an angel in combat. The answer to this paradox was discovered not by accident investigators, but by a young NASA engineer named Helen Reeves in 1967. Reeves, working on boundary layer control for supersonic transports, was given access to classified Air Force flight test data from the early F-104 program. She was tasked with a theoretical study. Why did the aircraft, notoriously prone to a violent pitch-up stall at high angles of attack, sometimes recover from that stall with a sudden, almost magical snap roll rather than the fatal flat spin predicted by the manuals? For months, she modeled the airflow, the tiny wings, the long fuselage, the placement of the intakes. It all pointed to disaster. Then she decided to model not just the wings, but the entire aircraft as a single lifting body. She incorporated data from a near-catastrophic test flight where a pilot, caught in the pitch-up, had slammed the control stick full forward and left, kicking in full rudder, in a desperate, non-standard input. Her supercomputer simulations revealed the secret. The F-104's greatest perceived flaw, its severe lack of lateral stability, a byproduct of those tiny wings and a fuselage that was essentially a long destabilizing lever, was, under specific high-energy conditions, its salvation. When the aircraft pitched up violently and began to lose airflow over the wings, it was on the verge of a stall. But because it was so laterally unstable, it had no desire to stay wings level. The moment it began to stall, one wing would drop, not gradually, but with the violent immediacy of a switch being thrown. This wing drop, combined with the massive thrust of the J-79 and the pilot's instinctive and trained counter-input, didn't result in a spin. Instead, it forced the aircraft into a violent, rolling scissors maneuver. The high thrust and the rolling motion would literally fling the nose through the stall, re-establishing airflow on the wings in a new attitude. It wasn't a recovery from a stall. It was a violent evasion of the stall condition altogether through controlled, aggravated instability.
Reeves called it dynamic instability recovery. The structural imbalance, the lack of lateral stability, created a unique aerodynamic effect. The aircraft was so twitchy that it couldn't settle into a stable, unrecoverable stall. It was always moving, always on the edge, and that edge, in the hands of a pilot who understood it, was where its unmatched agility lived. The pitch-up wasn't just a flaw, it was the trigger for a built-in, last-ditch escape maneuver that no other stable aircraft could perform.
Furthermore, she discovered that at high supersonic speeds, this same instability dampened out. The airflow over the long fuselage itself created stabilizing vortices. The aircraft was, in effect, two different planes, a nervous, hyper-alert, and incredibly agile beast at transonic speeds and a stable aerostraight dart at Mach 2. The report was classified immediately. It explained why the starfighter was so lethal in a dogfight it was never supposed to enter. A pilot who learned to ride the edge of its instability, to use the pitch-up to invite the wing drop and counter it with power and roll, could perform maneuvers that looked like radar ghosts to the Soviets. He was not fighting the aircraft's flaws, he was weaponizing them. It was like finding a winning lottery ticket in a design mistake. Kelly Johnson's team had stumbled upon a profound aerodynamic truth by accident. In the supersonic age, absolute stability could be a handicap. A measure of carefully managed instability could translate into supernatural agility. The secret to keeping the starfighter alive in combat was to embrace the very thing that made it deadly on the ground. The F-104 starfighter did not begin as a vision of the future. It began as a series of calculations on a chalkboard, a what-if scenario pushed to a terrifying extreme. It was an accident of design philosophy, born from Kelly Johnson's frustration with bureaucratic committees and his belief that the answer to any aerodynamic problem was more thrust. It was, in its purest form, a hot rod. It should have been a footnote, a dangerous experiment that claimed a few test pilots and was quietly shelved. But history intervened. The sudden, palpable threat of the Soviet high-altitude fleet created a desperate need for a specific tool. The starfighter, by pure happenstance, was that exact tool. It was the right accident at the right time. Its legacy is not one of balanced excellence. It is a legacy of rewriting the rules. Before the F-104, fighters were designed to be forgiving, to be stable gun platforms, to turn well. The starfighter declared that none of that mattered if you couldn't get to the fight. It redefined air superiority, not as winning a turning battle, but as dictating the terms of the battle itself. It forced a fundamental shift in strategy. Speed and altitude became the primary weapons, not maneuverability. This philosophy would birth its more successful, more balanced descendants, the F-4 Phantom, the F-15 Eagle, but the DNA of the missile with a man in it was in them all. It shaped U.S. strategy for decades by proving the value of qualitative technological leaps. It validated the skunkworks model of small, focused teams bypassing bureaucracy. It demonstrated that overwhelming performance in one key area could compensate for or even render irrelevant weaknesses in others. This calculus became the bedrock of American air power. Don't match the enemy, overmatch him in a dimension he cannot follow. And to this day, the few remaining pilots who wrestled the starfighter through the sky, who felt its terrifying vibration on takeoff, who experienced the otherworldly silence of a Mach 2 cruise, and who executed that savage, instability-driven role to evade a missile or secure a kill, say the same thing. They say it with a shake of the head, a distant look in their eyes, a mixture of awe and residual fear. It shouldn't have flown. They talk about the landing approaches that felt like controlled crashes, the engine flames that lit up the night, the way the runway never seemed to get any closer until it was suddenly a blur beneath them. But once it did, their eyes clear and the old focus returns. They remember the view from 60,000 feet, the curve of the Earth, the MiG that shrank in their windscreen, not because it was turning, but because they were simply arriving at its position in space faster than thought. Nothing could touch it. The starfighter was a paradox, a beautiful, lethal mistake that became a legend. It was the embodiment of a brutal, simple truth of the Cold War sky. Sometimes the machine that breaks all the rules is the one that writes the new ones. It was the jet that shouldn't have flown, and because it did, the world of aerial combat was never the same.